You're sitting in your car, staring at a piece of paper tucked under the windshield wiper. $75 for parking over a white line. You peel it off, mutter something about the city's priorities, and drive to work anyway. For almost all of human history, breaking a rule didn't end with a piece of paper. It ended in the village square, in front of everyone you had ever known, with your body, your freedom, or your place in the group as the only currency left. Every society that has existed has answered the same question. What do you do with someone who breaks the rules holding the group together? One answer keeps showing up everywhere. A punishment feared more than losing a hand, more than a beating, more than death itself. It left no trace an archaeologist could ever find. You felt a small version of that exact punishment yourself, and never knew it had a name. Most people assume ancient punishment was pure chaos. That assumption is mostly wrong. Take the Code of Hammurabi, written in Babylon around 1754 BC, one of the oldest surviving legal texts in the world. Close to 300 laws, carved into a 7-foot slab of black stone, and a striking number of them are obsessively specific about proportion. Legal historians point out that an eye for an eye wasn't originally a slogan for savagery. It was a ceiling, not a floor. Before codes like this existed, a wronged family could retaliate however far their anger carried them, and small disputes spiraled into blood feuds that swallowed entire villages for generations, sometimes running for decades after everyone involved in the original argument was already dead. The Italian principle, the law of exact retaliation, showed up specifically to stop that spiral. You break one tooth, you lose exactly one tooth, not the whole jaw, not the family line. The stone itself was set up in a public place, not locked away in a palace, specifically so an ordinary person could walk up and see, in exact terms, what would happen to them if they broke a given law, and what would happen to whoever wronged them in return. Ancient justice, at its most advanced, was trying to put a lid on cruelty, not unleash it. That doesn't mean it was gentle. Ancient Egypt sentenced serious offenders to have the nose or ears removed, a punishment chosen specifically because it was visible for life. A permanent mark, not a temporary one, that meant you couldn't hide what you'd done from anyone who ever looked at your face again. Ancient China's legal system listed 5 official categories of punishment on the books: tattooing the face, cutting off the nose, amputating a foot, castration, and death. They were recorded with almost bureaucratic bluntness as the 5 punishments. Rome had its own specialty reserved for military discipline called decimation. If a unit broke and ran from battle, the survivors were divided into groups of 10, and each group drew lots. One man in 10 was beaten to death by his own comrades with their bare hands, while the other 9 watched and lived. Imagine your project team showing up late to one deadline, and management responding by making the rest of the department personally execute 1 in 10 of you to send a message. Suddenly, that stern email about the shared office fridge doesn't sound so bad. Money problems could be just as dangerous as violence. In early Rome, before the practice was formally outlawed around 326 BC, a debtor who couldn't repay a loan could be legally bound over to work for whoever he owed, a system called nexum. There was no bankruptcy filing, no repayment plan, no fresh start. He kept his name and his citizenship on paper, but his labor, his time, and often his safety belonged to someone else until the debt was considered paid. Losing an argument about money didn't just cost you coin. It could cost you your freedom, sometimes for years, sometimes for life. Here's the question that should be sitting in the back of your mind. How did anyone actually get convicted of anything in the first place? In a world with no forensics, no fingerprints, and sometimes no witnesses at all. So some cultures didn't just punish crime, they let nature decide who was guilty before the punishment even started. Hammurabi's code included a real legal procedure known as the river ordeal. If someone was accused of a serious crime with no clear proof, they were thrown into the river. If they drowned, the river had judged them guilty and the sentence was already carried out. If they survived and swam to shore, the river had declared them innocent and they walked free. You didn't get a defense attorney, you got a current. That question is answered. But the bigger one is still open. What was the punishment that scared people more than a river, more than decimation, more than losing a hand or a foot? Centuries after Hammurabi, in ancient Athens, citizens could vote once a year to remove a fellow citizen from the city for 10 years, no crime required, just enough suspicion that he had become dangerous to the group. Each citizen scratched a name onto a broken piece of pottery. If enough shards named the same man, he had 10 days to leave, still technically a citizen, but cut off from every single thing that made citizenship worth having. The Greek word for those pottery shards was ostracon. That is where the word ostracism comes from. The Greeks didn't just practice this punishment. They named it, formalized it, and voted on it once a year like a civic holiday. Even Themistocles, the general credited with helping save Greece at the Battle of Salamis, was ostracized by his own city only a few years after the victory. Winning the war did not buy him a permanent exemption from the ballot. Centuries later, in Iceland and across early Germanic law, courts had an even blunter version of the same idea, called outlawry. An outlaw wasn't simply banished. The word meant exactly what it says, a person placed entirely outside the protection of the law. Anyone could kill an outlaw without facing any legal consequence at all, because as far as the law was concerned, that person no longer existed inside it. Icelandic sagas describe outlaws surviving alone in the highlands for years, hunted not by soldiers, but by anyone who happened to recognize their face. English common law carried a version of the same idea, describing an outlaw as having the head of a wolf. A person's society was permitted to treat exactly like a dangerous animal. It wasn't just a punishment. It was a total deletion from the rules that kept everyone else safe. Here's the thing. Nobody tells you about small-scale ancient societies, the hunter-gatherer bands that made up the vast majority of human existence before cities, before written law, before kings and city councils and pottery votes. Anthropologist Christopher Bohm spent decades studying dozens of these societies across every inhabited continent, and he found something almost identical repeating everywhere he looked. These groups were fiercely, deliberately equal, and Bohm called this pattern a reverse dominance hierarchy. Instead of one strong person ruling over everyone else, the whole group organized itself specifically to prevent that from ever happening. Nobody was allowed to dominate the group, and anyone who tried, a bully, a bragger, someone hoarding meat or power, got corrected through a predictable ladder of consequences. First, gossip. Then, open mockery to their face. Then, if that failed, something far heavier. The entire band would simply stop including them. No more sharing the fire. No more sharing the meat. No more being spoken to, planned with, or looked at by anyone. For a species that survived almost exclusively in groups for hundreds of thousands of years, with no real way to survive alone in the wild for long, that silence was closer to a death sentence than any blade. Bohm's research suggests execution itself was usually a last resort, reserved for people the group had already tried and failed to correct through exclusion first. The silence came before the knife, not after it, because the silence was already doing most of the work. But here's a question worth asking before we go any further. Why would being ignored, of all things, actually feel scarier than pain? In 2003, a neuroscientist named Naomi Eisenberger ran an experiment at UCLA using a simple computer game called Cyberball, where a person believed they were playing catch online with two other players. At some point, without warning, the other two players simply stopped throwing the ball to them. That's it. No insult, no threat. Just quiet exclusion from a game that didn't even matter. She scanned their brains while it happened, and the region that lit up, the anterior cingulate cortex, was the same region that activates during physical pain. Your brain does not fully separate a broken bone from being left out of a group. As far as your nervous system is concerned, they're close cousins. That's the punishment you already know, the silent treatment. Being left out of the group chat. Watching everyone else get invited somewhere you weren't. It feels disproportionately awful compared to what actually happened, and now you know why. You're running ancient software, built for a world where being cut off from the group wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was a death sentence with a long countdown attached. We built courts and lawyers and appeals and prisons with walls instead of exile with none. We traded blood feuds for civil suits, ostracon votes for jury summonses, and river ordeals for DNA labs. That parking ticket still folded in your glove compartment is the modern, watered-down descendant of all of it. The river, the pottery shard, the crowd gathered in the village square. Only the stakes got smaller. You get cut off in traffic and vent about it to a group chat that answers back in seconds. You send a message and feel a flicker of unease if it sits unread for an hour. You are mildly annoyed by a slow reply, a missed invite, a joke you weren't in on, a table where the conversation stops when you sit down. None of it would register as a crisis to anyone watching from the outside. Your ancestors would have recognized every one of those feelings instantly, and they would have called them something closer to a warning. But the oldest punishment of all never actually left. It just stopped needing a village, a river, or a piece of broken pottery to enforce it. It lives in a message left on read, a group chat you weren't added to, a photo from a night nobody told you about. You still flinch from it exactly the way your ancestors did, because underneath the paperwork and the parking tickets, you're still running the same old rule, the group is safety, and being pushed out of it is the one sentence nothing has ever fully cured.